It happens every 4 years. A nation wakes up with a single intoxicating thought that hums through the morning radio, dominates the office water cooler, and fuels every social media thread. This is the one. They look at the roster sheet and see a collection of names that reads like a dream team from a video game. They have the most clinical striker in Europe, a midfield maestro who dictates the tempo of the biggest leagues, and a defense anchored by players who have won everything there is to win at the club level. The media crowns them before a single ball is even kicked. The narrative is already written, the parades are being planned, and the expectations are suffocatingly high. And yet, when the final whistle blows and the confetti falls, they are always holding the exact same thing, nothing. It is a recurring nightmare that seems to transcend time and borders, from the flamboyant failures of the past to the polished, hyper-marketed squads of today. We call them the golden generations, those rare alignments of talent that should, by all laws of probability and merit, lift the trophy. But is that label actually a curse? Is it a kiss of death that sets these men up for a fall that feels more like a public execution than a sporting defeat? Today, we are not just looking at matches or highlights. We are peeling back the heavy velvet curtain on the psychology of expectation, the toxic hidden politics of the locker room, and the chilling, uncomfortable truth that in the chaos of a World Cup, raw talent is often the absolute least important variable on the field. We are going to explore why the most talented teams in the history of the sport don't just lose, they implode. We are talking about the paralysis of perfection, the weight of a nation's anxiety manifesting as heavy legs on the pitch, and the bizarre phenomenon where having the best players in the world becomes a tactical liability rather than an asset. As we stand here in 2026, looking at squads like England and Portugal, who are currently stacked with a level of individual brilliance that borders on the unfair, we have to stop and ask the uncomfortable question: is this roster a dream team, or are they walking directly into a psychological trap that has claimed every favorite before them? The history of football is littered with these stories, and if we don't understand the pattern, we are doomed to watch the same tragedy repeat itself over and over again. We are here to dismantle the myth of the superstar and find out what actually happens when you put 23 of the world's most competitive, ego driven, and hyper successful individuals in a pressure cooker and turn the heat all the way up to the maximum. It is time to look at the secret history of the game, the parts of the narrative that the post-match interviews and the highlight reels never show you. This is the story of the curse, the logic behind the collapse, and why sometimes being the best is the only thing standing between you and the glory you think you deserve. Welcome to the reality behind the hype, where we find out if a team can truly be too talented for its own good, or if the World Cup is simply an environment that fundamentally rejects the idea of a favorite. Forget what you think you know about tactical superiority and individual brilliance. The truth is far more human, far more fragile, and far more fascinating than any stat line could ever tell us. This is why the favorites always find a way to break our hearts, and more importantly, why they seem to be the architects of their own destruction. It is time to dive deep into the belly of the beast. To truly understand the anatomy of the curse, you have to look back at the turn of the millennium, a period that signaled the birth of the Galactico era. It wasn't just about the rise of mega clubs like Real Madrid. It was about the dangerous, unprecedented translation of that business model into the world of international football. Suddenly, the mandate for national team managers changed. They were no longer asked to build a cohesive, balanced system that could function under pressure. Instead, they were treated like high-end art curators, tasked with assembling a collection of individual celebrities who had reached the absolute peak of the sport. It created an environment where the sport felt less like a tactical battle and more like a high-stakes marketing campaign. The hype cycle became a predatory monster, feeding on headlines, kit launches, and relentless social media scrutiny. The marketing budgets alone were enough to ensure that the public didn't just want a win, they demanded a coronation. The pressure was manufactured, intensified, and sold back to the fans until the expectation wasn't just to compete, but to dominate every single opponent with ease. Consider the expectation gap. This is the psychological chasm that opens up between the wild, frenzied hype of the public and the cold, pragmatic reality of tactical preparation. Every time a new golden generation is announced, the gap widens. The fans and the media build a pedestal so high that the players, despite their immense talent, are essentially climbing toward a trap. When you are the favorite, you are no longer playing to win. You are playing to avoid the catastrophic humiliation of failing to meet the impossible standards set for you. It is a subtle but devastating shift in mindset. You stop taking the risks that lead to goals because you are terrified of the mistakes that lead to an early exit. Here is a staggering, retention shattering statistic. If you analyze the results of the last six World Cups, you will find that the team entering the tournament ranked number one in the world has won the trophy exactly 0 times, not once. Zero. It is a statistical anomaly that screams for an explanation. Why does the supposed best team in the world consistently falter? Because the golden generation tag changes the objective of the game. It creates an environment of total paralysis. The weight of a nation's expectation isn't just a poetic turn of phrase, it is a tangible, heavy, and exhausting load that manifests physically on the pitch. You can see it in the way players hold on to the ball for a split second too long, in the way they look for the safest pass instead of the brave one, and in the way they shrink when the clock begins to wind down. By the time the starting whistle blows in that opening group stage match, the team has often already lost the battle in their own minds. They aren't playing against their opponents, they are playing against the crushing, invisible weight of their own legacy, a legacy they have been told they must fulfill before they have even kicked a ball. It is a psychological trap that has claimed every favorite for decades, turning elite athletes into shadows of their club level selves. They arrive with the swagger of kings, but the weight of the crown turns out to be heavier than they ever imagined, pulling them down until they are paralyzed by the very thing that was supposed to make them invincible. This is the baseline, the foundation of the curse, and it is the exact moment where the collapse begins, long before the first penalty kick is even taken. To really dig into the heart of why these teams crumble, we have to talk about the invisible detail, the factor that almost never makes it onto the stat sheet, but effectively nukes a campaign from the inside out. When we look back at the most iconic golden generation, that legendary England squad from the mid 2000s, we often criticize the tactics, the formation, or the manager's choices. We debate the Lampard and Gerrard dilemma, asking why two of the best midfielders in the history of the sport couldn't find a way to coexist in the center of the park. But the real, uncomfortable truth wasn't about tactics, it was about the dinner table. It was about the fact that these men spent 11 months of the year trying to systematically dismantle each other in the Premier League. The animosity wasn't just a professional rivalry, it was deeply ingrained, tribal, and intensely personal. When they reported for international duty, that wall of silence didn't just disappear. The stories coming out of that era are nothing short of shocking when you consider the stakes. You had players who wouldn't sit together in the canteen, cliques formed exclusively around club loyalties, and an atmosphere that felt more like a tense summit between warring nations than a brotherhood of teammates. The Liverpool players stayed in their corner, the Chelsea boys held their ground, and the Manchester United contingent maintained their own sphere of influence. They weren't a team, they were a fragile, uneasy coalition of rival corporate firms forced into a merger they never asked for. This is the toxic politics of club loyalty. When you have a locker room filled with world-class egos and massive brand identities, you need a manager who isn't just a tactician, but a master diplomat, someone capable of dissolving those barriers and replacing them with a shared identity. But all too often, federations make the mistake of hiring the biggest name available, assuming that the presence of high-profile talent will magically solve the problem of cohesion. The tragedy of this is that the players themselves were acutely aware of the friction. It became an open secret that there were times on the pitch where players simply wouldn't pass to a teammate they spent the rest of the year battling for league titles. It sounds impossibly petty for professionals at this level, but you have to understand the microdynamics of elite football. A successful attack is built on split second anticipation, a telepathic understanding of where your teammate is going to be before they even move. That level of connection requires absolute, unwavering trust. If there is even a flicker of resentment, if there is a hesitation that lasts for just half a second because a player is subconsciously debating whether or not they want to set up their league rival for the glory, the entire rhythm of the team is destroyed. That micro hesitation is the difference between a goal and a broken down counterattack. It's a failure of emotional intelligence that the football world consistently ignores. We obsess over the fancy footwork and the highlight reel goals, but we ignore the human element that binds those moments together. When you prioritize individual pedigree over collective synergy, you aren't building a team, you are building a ticking time bomb. Every time a pass didn't come or a defensive line failed to shift in unison, it wasn't a lack of talent, it was the legacy of the domestic season bleeding into the international arena. It was the subconscious choice to prioritize the pride of the club over the success of the country. This is the dark, invisible architecture of the collapse. It is the reason why a team of superstars can look so fluid on paper and so disjointed on the pitch. And it is a lesson that every single golden generation has had to learn the hard way. If you cannot fix the relationships off the pitch, no amount of money, marketing, or individual brilliance will ever be enough to win the World Cup. It is the ultimate testament to the fact that football is not just a game of legs and lungs, but a game of hearts and minds. And if those parts aren't aligned, the whole structure inevitably begins to fracture. We need to pull back the lens and look at the chess match of a high stakes knockout game as if we were watching a masterclass in psychological pressure. It is the 80-minute, the score is deadlocked at 0-0. The humidity is rising, the crowd noise is a rhythmic, oppressive hum, and your so-called golden generation is standing on the precipice of absolute disaster. This is where the too talented paradox turns lethal. When a squad is overflowing with superstars, you don't actually have a clear hierarchy of responsibility. In a more balanced team, everyone knows their role. The worker, the creator, the finisher. But in a team of giants, you have a room full of people who are used to being the protagonist of every story they inhabit. When things start to go wrong, when the defense is stubborn or the referee's whistle feels against them, the team lacks a defined survival instinct. Who takes the free kick? Who is the leader who calms the panic? When the pressure reaches that boiling point, everyone looks to someone else to be the hero. Or worse, everyone decides they are the only one who can save the day. This is the moment where the golden generation begins to cannibalize itself. Watch the body language during these final agonizing minutes. In a cohesive, gritty underdog team, there is a visible sense of collective suffering. They move together, they protect each other, and they grind out results through sheer unity. But in a room full of superstars, you see something entirely different, a slow motion descent into individual desperation. There is a distinct, agonizing shift in the decision making process here. A player who has spent his entire career being told he is the best in the world suddenly feels the need to prove it. He sees a teammate in a better position, but his ego, or perhaps the fear of failing to be the savior, tells him to try the impossible dribble through three defenders instead. He drifts out of his tactical position, chasing the ball because he doesn't trust his teammates to do the job. The carefully constructed formation, the foundation the coaching staff spent months refining, effectively dissolves into nothingness. It becomes a game of 11 isolated individuals, each trying to rewrite the narrative with a single, spectacular moment of magic. They are no longer playing to the system, they are playing to their own highlight reel, hoping that a moment of individual brilliance will save them from the national autopsy that follows a loss. But in the World Cup, that kind of individualism is a death sentence. The best teams in tournament history aren't the ones with the most skill. They are the ones who can suppress their own egos for the sake of the collective. When you have too many stars, you have too many voices, too many competing agendas, and too many people waiting for someone else to take the risk. You end up with a team that has all the ingredients of a champion, but lacks the essential invisible glue of humility. The curse isn't a mystical phenomenon or bad luck at the penalty spot. It is the direct logical output of a system that has forgotten how to be a unit. It is the moment the structure collapses under the weight of its own excellence. It is the sound of a chess engine being forced to play a game of checkers where every piece is trying to be the king. This is where the tournament is won or lost, not in the training ground, but in the final desperate minutes where the individual must die so that the team can live. And for the favorites, that is a price they rarely, if ever, are willing to pay. The aftermath of these collapses is always hauntingly consistent. Once the final whistle blows, the golden generation doesn't just lose a match, they witness the swift, brutal disintegration of an entire era. The manager is inevitably ushered out, the locker room is hollowed out, and the squad is dismantled as the realization sets in that a decade of potential has evaporated into thin air. But the damage goes much deeper than just a tournament exit. It seeps into the very marrow of a national program's self-esteem. It creates a generational trauma, a lingering shadow that hangs over every subsequent training camp and every friendly match. The next crop of players doesn't just step onto the pitch, they inherit a legacy of failure, terrified of being the ones to confirm the choker label that has been stamped onto their crest. They play with the frantic, nervous energy of people who are trying to outrun a ghost, and that desperation is the final nail in the coffin. So, when we strip away the marketing, the endorsements, and the sheer audacity of the talent on display, we have to face the cold, hard question: is the World Cup simply a matter of chemistry over quality? If we look at the champions who have actually managed to lift the trophy, the nations that found a way to bridge the gap between expectation and execution, we see a recurring pattern. They weren't always the teams with the best strikers or the most expensive defenders. They were the teams that forged a common enemy. They were the squads that managed to subordinate their individual brands, their egos, and their club level allegiances to a single, burning, singular purpose. They were teams that functioned with a sacrificial, almost monastic commitment to the guy standing next to them. They were units that had mastered the art of suffering together, knowing that in a 4 week tournament, the quality of your relationships is just as important as the quality of your touch. This brings us to the core of the dilemma, and it's a question that I want you to really sit with. If you were sitting in that manager's chair, tasked with steering a massive global superpower through the pressure cooker of the World Cup, would you have the courage to make the hard choice? Would you bench your biggest superstar, the face of the brand, the man who sells the most shirts and commands the most headlines, if you knew that dropping him was the only way to heal the chemistry of the locker room? Would you sacrifice the individual for the collective, knowing that you might be crucified by the media for doing so, but that it might be the only way to actually win the tournament? Can a team in the modern era of celebrity and branding ever truly be too talented for its own good? Or is the golden generation a structural impossibility, a concept that tries to force the game of football into a shape that it simply refuses to take? The game is won in the mind long before it is won on the grass. The physics of the World Cup are unforgiving. It demands a synergy that requires you to forget your own name and remember the badge. Until these nations stop assembling collections of the world's greatest players and start building tribes of the world's most selfless teammates, the curse will remain undefeated. The favorites will continue to arrive with the confidence of gods, only to leave with the hollow eyes of those who have seen their own hubris laid bare. The question isn't whether they have enough talent, they have more than enough. The question is whether they have the character to stop being a golden generation and start being a team. I want to hear your thoughts on this. If your national team is stuck in this cycle, who do you blame? Is it the players, the media, or the system itself? Drop your take in the comments because this is where the real history of the sport is written, not in the trophy cabinet, but in the lessons we learn from the failures that define us. The cycle will turn again, but the curse only breaks when the story finally changes. The World Cup doesn't care about your reputation, your marketing, or the names on the back of your shirts. It only answers to the team that finds its soul before the pressure pulls it apart. So until next time, keep watching, keep questioning, and let me know who you think has the heart to break the curse.